The first thing I ever heard Bruce Bishop say was a lie. Not a cruel one, not even an intentional one maybe. But a lie all the same, and the funny thing about lies is that sometimes you hold on to them tighter than the truth, because the truth doesn't smell like cedar and pine resin and something warm and wild underneath. Something that makes your knees want to forget they're a structural part of your body. I was standing in the doorway of the Westbrook Pack's meeting hall, a converted barn on the north edge of the property, smelling of old wood and decades of gathered wolves. When I heard him say it to someone across the room, his voice carried the way alpha voices always do, not loud exactly, but with that particular gravity that makes the air itself seem to lean in and listen. "He's free to leave whenever he wants," Bruce said, arms crossed, profile sharp against the amber lantern light. "I don't keep anyone here who doesn't choose to stay." The person he was speaking to, I'd later learn it was his second, a stocky man named Dale, nodded slowly, casting a glance in my direction that I pretended not to notice. And there I was, Felix Ellison, 23 years old, newly designated Omega, recently homeless in the most technical sense, having just walked out of the Caldwell Pack's territory with a single bag over my shoulder and a formal letter of release that still crinkled in my jacket pocket every time I breathed too deeply. Free to leave. Sure. I had nowhere else to go. That wasn't Bruce's fault. He hadn't lured me here with false promises. His pack's reputation as a sanctuary for displaced wolves was well established. My old pack's mediator had suggested Westbrook as a transitional territory, somewhere I could stabilize before figuring out the next chapter. I'd arrived by bus, then by foot, my sneakers damp from the meadow grass, my heart doing something between a waltz and a war. Bruce turned around before I had the chance to compose myself into something resembling a person with dignity. His eyes found mine immediately. That's an alpha thing, that precision, the way they orient in a room like a compass finding north. Except I was whatever direction he was pointing, apparently, because every nerve in my body lit up at once and my carefully maintained expression of casual composure nearly slid right off my face. He was tall. That part I'd been warned about. What I hadn't been warned about was the rest of it. The way his dark hair was slightly rumpled, like he'd been running his hands through it before I arrived. The faint scar that crossed his jaw at an angle that should have been distracting but instead just made his face interesting. The steadiness in his gray eyes that felt less like authority and more like patience. Like he'd been waiting for something for a very long time and had made peace with the waiting. "Felix Ellison," he said, walking toward me. "That's me," I said. "Brilliant, stunning repartee." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, something more restrained. Bruce Bishop. He stopped a few feet away, respectful distance I noticed. Pack alphas who wanted to intimidate didn't do that. They closed space. "Welcome to Westbrook. Are you hungry?" I blinked. What? It's past dinner time. You came in on the 4 o'clock bus from Harte, yes? That's a long ride. Are you hungry? I was, actually. Deeply. I hadn't eaten since a granola bar at 11 that morning because I'd been too anxious to think about food. But I hadn't expected that to be the first question. I'd expected protocol, hierarchy, a formal acknowledgement of my status and the terms of my temporary residency. "Yes," I said, and hated how small my voice sounded. "Good." He turned and gestured for me to follow. "Come on, the kitchen's still warm." That was how it started. Not with ceremony, not with power plays or dominance displays or any of the things I'd been quietly bracing for my entire 3-hour bus ride. It started with Bruce Bishop walking me to a large, well-lit kitchen that smelled of garlic and roasted vegetables, pulling out a stool at a worn wooden island, and putting a bowl of leftover stew in front of me with the same matter-of-fact ease someone might use to feed a cat that had shown up cold at the back door. I ate. He sat across from me, not watching me exactly, but present, reading something on his phone occasionally, setting it down whenever I glanced up. "You don't have to stay here for the conversation," I said after a while. "I know." He didn't leave. There was a silence that should have been awkward and wasn't, which was perhaps the most disorienting thing about the entire evening. I'd been in other packs. I'd experienced the way temporary members got quietly assessed, the invisible tests, the careful calibration of where you ranked and what you were worth and how much space you were allowed to take up. None of that was happening, or if it was happening somewhere too subtle for me to detect. Dale mentioned you were with Caldwell for 2 years, Bruce said eventually. Almost. 22 months. And before that, independent. For about 8 months after I left my family's pack. He nodded, neither pressing nor pulling away from it. And your designation, they said it was recent. 4 months ago. I set my spoon down. Late presentation. Apparently it happens. It does. His voice was neutral, but not cold. How are you handling it? The directness of the question caught me off guard enough that I almost answered honestly. Almost. Fine, I said instead. His gray eyes held mine for a moment, and I had the uncomfortable feeling that he knew exactly how not fine I was and was choosing to let me have the lie for now. Good, he said. My pack has 6 omegas, if that matters to you. None of them were born to it either. You'll find your footing. Later that night. Installed in a small but genuinely comfortable room in the east wing of the main house. A room with actual curtains and a bookshelf and a window that looked out onto an oak tree. I lay on top of the covers and stared at the ceiling and thought about what he'd said. You're free to leave whenever you want. I pressed my thumb against the crinkled edge of my release letter in my jacket pocket, hanging on the back of the door. I didn't sleep for a long time. 3 weeks passed before I stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop. Westbrook was, as far as I could tell, aggressively functional. There were about 40 wolves in the pack, ranging in age from 7 to 70, spread across the main property and a few adjacent holdings. The dynamics were not what I was used to. In Caldwell, hierarchy had been a living, breathing, constantly reinforced thing. You knew your place the way you knew the layout of a building, by the specific quality of light in each room, by which doors were open and which weren't. At Westbrook, the hierarchy existed, but it breathed differently. People talked to Bruce like he was a person, not like they were challenging him. That undertone of challenge wasn't there. But they also weren't performing deference. They just talked to him. I watched this for a week before I could identify what was strange about it. Then it hit me. Nobody was afraid of him. I, on the other hand, was a little afraid of him, but for entirely the wrong reasons. I took meals with the pack, helped with whatever tasks were going. Westbrook ran a small sustainable farm operation and sold honey and woodworked goods at regional markets. I was terrible at the farm work and reasonably decent at the woodwork, which surprised everyone, including me. The pack's craftsman, an older Omega named Harold, taught me how to properly sand a joint smooth, and for 2 hours, every afternoon, I stood in his workshop feeling for the first time in months. Like I knew what my hands were for. Bruce would pass through occasionally, always with some specific purpose. Checking a delivery, reviewing plans with Harold, talking through something with whichever pack member needed him. He never lingered near me unnecessarily, and I told myself I wasn't tracking his movements. I was simply observant by nature. He did have a habit, I noticed, of making sure I was included when group things happened. Not in an overt way. Not by singling me out and making the inclusion conspicuous. More like a door left ajar, a space held open. He'd say something to the group that created an opening, and if I stepped through it, the opening had been there. If I didn't, it had just been a sentence. The first time I tested this theory was 3 weeks in, at a pack bonfire. It was a Thursday evening, cooling off the way early autumn evenings do, that first whisper of the cold that's more suggestion than temperature. Someone had gotten a fire going in the stone pit behind the main house. There were maybe 15 pack members there, clustered in their natural social groupings. I stood on the periphery with a mug of something hot and observed. Bruce was on the other side of the fire, laughing at something a young beta named Mara had said. The firelight caught the angles of his face and did things to my concentration. I looked away, into my mug, at the oak tree, back at Bruce, because apparently I had no self-preservation. The bench has more room if you want to sit. I startled. He'd moved, quietly, for someone his size, and was now standing beside me, looking at the bench in question, which was a long, split-log affair that was indeed mostly empty. "I'm fine standing," I said. "I know." He didn't move. Stood beside me instead, watching the fire with the same steady patience he seemed to apply to most things. Mara's telling that story again about the time Dale got his boot stuck in the pond mud. "You missed it last month. It's worth hearing." "How do you know I missed it last month?" He glanced at me sideways. "You weren't here last month." "Right." I felt my face do something warm and embarrassing. "Obviously. I just meant, it's a good story, if you wanted company." He shrugged, easy and unforced. "Or if you didn't, the bench is there." He wandered back toward Mara and the fire. I stood for another minute. Then I went and sat on the bench. Mara's story was, in fact, excellent. By the time it was over, I had laughed genuinely for the first time in I couldn't remember how long, and when I looked up, Bruce was watching me from across the fire with an expression I couldn't entirely read. Not smug. Not calculating. Something quieter than that. Like he'd been hoping for something and had just seen the first sign of it. I looked back at the fire and told myself very firmly that I was not going to make this complicated. I made it complicated approximately 6 days later. It started with a practical problem. Omega biology, newly active, was doing what omega biology does, which is to say it was making me acutely sensitive to things I had previously been blissfully unaware of. Pack territories have a scent architecture, layers of individual scents that create the pack's collective smell, with the alpha scent forming the foundation. Most wolves who've grown up in packs barely notice this. I had been in exactly one pack before Westbrook, and during my time there my secondary nature had been dormant, so I'd experienced it the way a beta would. Now I was experiencing it differently. Bruce's scent was cedar and pine resin, and something I didn't have a clean word for. Something warm and deep that the rational part of my brain identified as the specific olfactory signature of this particular alpha, and that every other part of my brain identified as, yes. That more of that, please. This was embarrassing and inconvenient, and I was managing it with what I felt was considerable dignity. Right up until the morning, I walked into the kitchen at 7 a.m. to find Bruce standing at the counter in a gray t-shirt, hair damp from a recent shower, and the entire room saturated with his scent. And my carefully maintained composure simply went offline. I stood in the doorway. He looked up from the coffee he was making. We both stared at each other for what was probably 2 seconds and felt like significantly longer. "Good morning," he said. "Morning," I said from somewhere very far away. He turned back to his coffee. I crossed the kitchen to the refrigerator, got out the orange juice, poured a glass, put the orange juice away, and then stood there holding my glass and not remembering what I'd come into the kitchen for. "Are you all right?" His voice was carefully measured. "Fine. I drank the orange juice. Just woke up." A pause. He poured his coffee. Added nothing to it, I noticed. Just black. "I want to..." He started, then stopped. I waited. "There's something I should probably say," he continued, turning around to lean against the counter, cradling his mug. His expression was serious, but not unkind. "About the pack dynamics, about how things work here." "Okay. Your designation is recent. The pack's scent is going to affect you more strongly for a while. That's just biology." He kept his eyes steady on mine. "Nothing here is a signal. Nothing you're experiencing is intended on anyone's part to move you in any particular direction. That's important for you to know." I felt heat climb my neck. "I know that. I know you know it." He paused. "I'm saying it out loud because I think sometimes knowing a thing and hearing a thing are different, and I don't want you to feel like you're navigating something you don't have a map for." I set down my orange juice glass, crossed my arms, looked at a point slightly to the left of his face because meeting his eyes at that particular moment felt like something that might tip me over. "And what about your scent specifically?" I said, and then immediately wanted to walk directly out of the building and keep walking until I reached a different continent. Silence. "What about it?" His voice was neutral, careful. "It's prominent," I said, which was possibly the understatement of the decade. "I'm not complaining, I'm just asking how other new Omegas have handled it." Another pause, longer than the first. When I made myself look at his face, there was something there that wasn't in his careful voice, a slight tension around his jaw, quickly smoothed. Usually it calibrates, he said. Within a few weeks, the body stops reacting to it as novel. It just becomes part of the background. And if it doesn't? He met my gaze. Then we talk about practical adjustments. The conversation ended there. Or ended there officially. We both went about our mornings. I went to Harold's workshop. I sanded a joint smooth and then spent 20 minutes staring at the wood grain. The thing was, and I turned this over and over in the following days, worrying at it the way you worry at a loose thread. He hadn't said it wouldn't happen, the calibration, the fading of the response. He'd said usually, not always. I filed that in the part of myself that I was carefully not looking at directly. October arrived, and with it the kind of weather that has opinions. A front came through that turned the valley into a study in wind and horizontal rain, knocking out the power on the east side of the property for 6 hours and stranding 3 pack members who'd gone into town for supplies. I was in Harold's workshop when it started. The workshop had its own generator and its own warm fug of sawdust and linseed oil, and I might have stayed there all evening except that around 8 o'clock, Bruce appeared in the doorway. His jacket was wet at the shoulders. He'd been outside dealing with whatever emergency the storm had produced. "Harold, we're moving dinner to the main hall since the east kitchen's dark," he said, then glanced at me. "Felix, you good?" "Fine here." "Good." He didn't move. "Bring what you're working on if you want. Dale's wife is doing candles. It'll be atmospheric." Harold was already beginning to pack up his tools. I looked at the drawer face I was working on, almost done with the joinery, and felt the familiar pull of 2 options: stay in the safe, small orbit of the workshop, or go where the light was. I went. The main hall with candles was, I had to admit, something. The long tables were pulled into a rough square, mismatched candlesticks clustered in the center, the shadows soft and warm. Someone had set up a radio, because the power outage had apparently activated everyone's collective desire for dramatic ambiance. It was playing something low and indistinct, classical maybe, or one of those folk stations that existed somewhere in the middle of the FM dial. I found a seat near the end of one table. Ate the dinner that appeared in front of me. Soup, bread, some kind of roasted root situation that was excellent. Around me, the pack settled into the particular ease of people who know each other well, the conversation moving in currents I was beginning to understand, if not yet fully navigate. Bruce sat diagonally across the table from me. We didn't speak during dinner, which was fine, normal. The table was full of conversations, and there was no particular reason for us to direct them at each other. I talked to Mara, who was explaining her theory that the east side power outage was the result of the ancient oak on the property line finally having the argument it had always wanted to have with the power lines. But I was aware of him in the low light, the way you're aware of a fire in a dark room, not looking at it constantly, but knowing exactly where the warmth was. After dinner, when people drifted into smaller clusters and the candles burned lower, I ended up on one of the benches along the wall, having picked up the book I'd left there 2 days ago. I wasn't really reading it. I was thinking about the drawer face and whether I needed a different grit on the sanding block. "What are you reading?" Bruce sat down beside me. Not across. Beside. Close enough that I could smell the rain still faint in his jacket. I showed him the cover. A novel. Mid-century literary fiction, something I'd found on the bookshelf in my room. "Any good?" He settled back against the wall, legs stretched out. "Honestly, I've read the same paragraph about 6 times and can't tell you what it says." He made a quiet sound that was almost a laugh. Storm-brained. Something like that. The music on the radio had shifted to something slower. Outside, the wind was still having its feelings about October, rattling the hall's high windows in their frames. "Can I ask you something?" I said, before I could think better of it. "Yes." "Why did you take me in?" I set the book down. "I know the official answer. Westbrook's reputation, transitional territory, etc. But you didn't have to make room. Your pack isn't hurting for space, but you didn't have to make it personal." He was quiet for a moment, and I had the sense he was actually considering the question rather than reaching for a ready answer. "Dale's brother-in-law is a mediator in the Hartay district," he said finally. "He told me about your situation. Not the details, just that there was a late-presenting Omega who needed somewhere to land and hadn't had an easy time of it. And I've been in situations where I didn't have somewhere to land." He said it simply, without drama. "It was a long time ago. It doesn't matter anymore. But I remember what it felt like to be standing somewhere temporary, waiting to be told what came next." I looked at his profile in the candlelight, the scar on his jaw, the way his hands rested easy on his knees, no tension in them. "You were a Pack Alpha at 26, I said. "I looked you up. It was pretty much in every report about Westbrook." He glanced at me with a slight surprise that he didn't try to conceal. "You researched me. Before I came. I like to know where I'm going." A pause. "You started the Pack from scratch. No inherited territory, no established bloodline. Just you and 7 people who decided to make something." "9, he said, "and most of the credit belongs to them. I mostly provided the alpha biology and the legal paperwork." That's not what I read. Something in his expression shifted, not discomfort exactly, but a kind of careful rebalancing. People tell stories about things. The stories get cleaner over time than the reality was. What was the reality? He thought about it. Messy, terrifying sometimes. A lot of nights where I wasn't sure I was doing right by people and had to decide to keep going anyway and trust that the intention mattered as much as the outcome. I sat with that for a moment. Outside, the storm was beginning to ease, the rain quieter now, the wind losing its edge. "I'm not going to leave," I said, before I'd fully formed the intention to say it. He turned to look at me. "I mean, I know you said I'm free to leave whenever, and I know that's true, but I stopped, started again. "I'm not planning to." I wanted to say that, in case it matters, for planning purposes. A silence that had a texture to it. Then, "It matters." His voice was low and even, but something in it had shifted quality, like a note held longer than expected. I picked up my book. Read the same paragraph a 7th time. Couldn't have told you a word of it. We sat together in the declining candlelight while the storm finished with its feelings and the pack wound down around us, and I let myself, very carefully, unfold just a little into the warmth of being somewhere that felt not like home yet, but like the possibility of it. Harold was approximately 67 years old, had been with Westbrook almost since the beginning, and possessed the specific wisdom of someone who had been paying attention for a very long time without any particular agenda. He also, I discovered, had known Bruce since Bruce was 24, and newly arrived in the valley with his 9 founding pack members and an expression that Harold described with the mild affection of retrospect. As a man convincing himself he was fine when he absolutely was not. Harold told me this over woodwork one November morning, approximately 6 weeks after my arrival, in the same conversational tone he might use to discuss the grain of white oak. "He built this place the way some people build walls," Harold said, fitting a dovetail joint together with the satisfaction of someone who has done this so many times, the pieces yield to him. "Good solid structure. Everyone inside it protected. But the builder on the outside." I ran my sandpaper along a curve. "Is that a critique?" "It's an observation." Harold held up his joint and examined it. "He's better than he was. The pack helped with that. You can't really maintain full separation from 40 people who refuse to let you. But he still has gaps." "What kind of gaps?" Harold set his joint down, looked at me in the particular way he had. Not intrusive, just clear. The kind where he assumes he doesn't get to want things. I kept sanding. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're going to figure it out eventually, and it will be useful to have context." "Figure out what?" He went back to his joint. "How he looks at you when you're not looking." I put my sandpaper down on the workbench and stared at it for a moment, then picked it up and continued. "You're very comfortable with other people's business," I said. "I'm an old Omega in a pack full of young people in drama," Harold said pleasantly. "It's basically my native habitat." Later that day, I carried the thing Harold had said around with me like a stone in my pocket, aware of its weight, not sure what to do with it. I knew what he was implying. I was, as I may have mentioned, not an idiot. I had been aware of something in Bruce's attention for weeks, the same way you're aware of a change in weather before you have the evidence of clouds. A quality of presence when we were in the same space. A way of listening when I spoke that made me feel like my words were being received rather than simply heard. But Bruce was also a pack alpha. I was a newly presenting omega in temporary residence. The power differential between those two facts was not abstract. I thought about the morning in the kitchen. Nothing here is a signal. I wondered if he'd been telling me that or reminding himself. The first real snow came the second week of December, and Westbrook had opinions about snow. The main house got decorated, the workshop got a small tree. Someone organized a cookie situation that took over the entire kitchen for a weekend and filled the house with the smell of warm sugar and vanilla for 3 days. I stayed for it. I'd known for weeks I was going to stay past my initial transitional period. The conversation with Bruce had shifted something, not dramatically, not confessionally, but like a door moving on its hinge. I was here. I was choosing to be here. That meant something different than being here because I had nowhere else. My room had acquired small transformations. Books from the shelf arranged in an order I'd chosen. A mug I'd claimed from the kitchen because it was the right size for my hands. A drawing I'd done of the oak tree outside my window tacked to the wall above the desk. A pack member named Celia, one of the 6 Omegas, had taken me on a shopping run in mid-November. She was 31, had been with Westbrook for 4 years, and was the sort of person who communicated primarily through practical action. She didn't ask how I was doing. She just appeared and said, "You need winter boots," and drove me to town and stood in the store with her arms crossed while I tried on 8 pairs. On the way back, she said, unprompted, "Bruce is worried he's crowding you." I looked at her profile while she drove. What? He keeps asking Dale if you seem like you have enough space. Dale keeps telling him yes. She changed lanes with the efficiency of someone who has fully made peace with the fact that other cars exist. Dale told me because he was tired of being asked and wanted me to tell you so you could do something about it. Do something about what? About Bruce being an idiot, she said with profound fondness. He's not an idiot. He's not a complete idiot. But he's been running a pack on the core principle that everyone here gets to make their own choices, which is good and true and correct. But he's applied it so comprehensively to you specifically that he's basically twisted himself in a knot trying not to influence anything. She glanced at me, which you probably already know. I said nothing. You don't have to do anything, she added more gently. I just thought you should know it's not indifference. I looked at the winter fields going by outside the window, the stubble of harvested corn striped white with first frost. What makes you think I've been reading it as indifference? I said. She smiled at the road. Fair. Back at Westbrook, I put my new boots in the closet of my room and stood for a moment in the quiet. The house smelled of the pack, of all 40 of them woven together into something that felt, incrementally, increasingly, less like borrowed warmth and more like mine. I pressed my hand flat against the wall beside the doorframe. This room, this wall, this particular crack in the ceiling plaster that I'd started thinking of as a landmark. Not leaving, definitely not leaving. The question was, what to do with what I was staying for. The main house had a library, not a grand one, more of a room that had absorbed books over the course of decades, until the books outnumbered the furniture and the furniture had been rearranged to accommodate them. 2 armchairs and a lamp and shelves that covered every wall. It smelled of dust and paper and the faint ghost of whoever had spent time there before me. I'd been using it most evenings. It was where I read and where I thought, and where I occasionally just sat in the armchair nearest the lamp and listened to the house settle around me. 2 weeks before the winter solstice, Bruce found me there. He knocked on the open door, an unnecessary but characteristic courtesy, and held up a piece of paper. Invoice for the Harold's hardware order. He says you signed for it, but the supplier put it under the wrong account. Oh, I straightened. Right, I signed for that. Want me to? It's handled. He set the paper on the corner table near the door, which was the natural stopping point for someone delivering a message. But he didn't leave. "Are you—" "He started, Celia told me," I said, before I could lose my nerve. He stopped. "That you were worried about crowding me," I continued. The lamp was very warm and my heart was doing something unreasonable. "She said Dale told her because you kept asking." A long silence. Then, "Dale has no sense of operational security." "It's not an operation." "No," he said, "it's not." He came farther into the room. Not toward me. He sat in the other armchair, the one across the lamp, and rested his elbows on his knees. And for a moment he just looked at the floor between his feet with the expression of a person assembling something they've been meaning to assemble for a while. "I told you when you arrived that you were free to leave whenever you wanted," he said. "I remember. I meant it. I know you did. I know you did." But it wasn't the whole truth. He looked up at me, and his gray eyes in the lamplight were doing something to my ability to breathe normally. "The complete truth is that He stopped. Started again. "I have been very careful since you got here to make sure that nothing I did felt like pressure, like expectation, like you owed me any particular response to anything, because you're here, and because of what I am, and because you're—" Another pause, almost frustrated. "Because you're you." "Because I'm an omega," I said. "Because you're Felix," he said, and the correction was so immediate and unguarded that it effectively removed my ability to think for approximately 4 seconds. The lamp hummed. Somewhere in the house, someone laughed at something, faint, distant. "What are you trying to say?" I asked, and my voice was quieter than I intended. He sat back, looked at me with something that was, if I was reading it right, the expression of a man who has been honest with himself about something for a long time, but hasn't yet said it out loud. "I don't want you to leave," he said. "I've known that since about the 3rd day you were here. And I've also known that the only version of that truth that's worth anything is the version where you stay because you want to. Not because of anything I've done or said, or because the biology made it hard to think clearly about what you actually want." "And what if what I actually want," I said carefully, "is to stay?" He was very still for a moment. "Then I'd want to know what that means for you," he said. "Not for me, for you. Whether it means you're comfortable here and you've built something worth keeping, which is good, which is exactly what this place is supposed to be, or whether it means something else." I thought about Harold, who'd said he doesn't get to want things, about Celia, who'd said he's twisted himself in a knot, about Bruce in this room right now, doing his level best to be scrupulously fair to me, even when being scrupulously fair was clearly costing him something. "It means something else," I said. The silence that followed was the particular kind that isn't empty. He didn't move. Didn't close the space between us, which was somehow exactly right. He'd said his piece, and now he was waiting, in the way that he always waited, patient and steady and not demanding anything. "I came here with a release letter in my pocket and nowhere to go," I said. "And you fed me soup and didn't make me talk and let me find the workshop and gave me a room with an oak tree outside the window." I looked at him. "And then you very carefully spent 2 months not doing anything about the fact that you were— I don't know the right word. Present. You were just present, and you never used it to push me in any direction, and it was the most." I stopped, because the emotion had arrived suddenly enough that my voice needed a moment. It was the most respectful thing anyone has ever done for me. His jaw was tight. I could see it from across the lamp. "I would like," I said, steadier now, "for you to continue to be present. In a less restrained way. A beat. 2. Felix. Yes. Are you sure? Bruce." I set my book down. "I've read the same paragraph 12 separate times over the past 6 weeks. I've been sure for a while." He made a sound that was, unmistakably, a laugh. A real one, sudden and unguarded, and it changed his face entirely, softened the angles, and I thought, oh, there he is." He stood up, crossed the room, stopped in front of my armchair, close now, close enough, and looked down at me with his gray eyes warm and his expression unguarded for the first time since I'd arrived. "Can I—" he started. Yes, I said before he finished, because we had been circling this for long enough. He reached out and tucked a strand of my hair behind my ear with the most careful, deliberate touch I'd ever experienced, like I was something he was afraid to mishandle. Then he cupped my jaw in one hand, tilting my face up, and the first time he kissed me was soft. Testing. Present. I reached up and grabbed the front of his shirt and kissed him back, and felt, somewhere in the architecture of myself, something that had been waiting for a long time finally put down its luggage. The thing about falling into something you've been circling for weeks is that the morning after is less dramatic than you might imagine and more overwhelming at the same time. I woke up in my room. We talked in the library for an hour after the kiss, actual talking, which turned out to be its own kind of intimacy, and lay still for a moment listening to the house. It was early, that particular gray light hour before anyone else was moving. Everything was the same. The oak tree was outside the window, bare now in December. The crack in the ceiling plaster was still there. My books were in their order. And something was completely different. I showered, dressed, went downstairs, and found Bruce already in the kitchen. He'd been up for a while, from the look of it. Coffee already made, papers spread on the kitchen island, reading glasses on that I hadn't known he wore. He looked up when I walked in. We looked at each other for a moment. "Morning," he said, "morning." I crossed to the coffee and poured a cup. "What are those?" "Farm maintenance schedule. Harold wants to reconfigure the south storage before spring." He slid them over slightly so I could see. "I've been trying to figure out if we can do it without losing the whole February supply run." I looked at the papers, made a small suggestion about the sequence of steps that occurred to me based on the conversations I'd had with Harold. He considered it, made a note. We both drank coffee. "Is this going to be weird?" I asked. "Is what going to be weird?" "This." I gestured between us, at the kitchen, at the morning, at the complete normalcy of it. Was it supposed to be more? I don't know. Momentous. "Moments don't have to be large to be significant," he said, and then looked slightly surprised at himself. That sounded more philosophical than I meant it to. "It's 7 a.m. You're allowed to be philosophical." He refiled the papers, took his glasses off, looked at me with something that was direct, fully present. Not the careful, measured attention of the past 2 months, but something less managed. "I've wanted this for a while," he said, in case that wasn't completely obvious. "If you have questions about what this is or what I want, I'd rather answer them directly than have you wonder." I leaned against the counter. "Okay, what do you want?" He didn't hesitate. "I want you to keep living here. In the pack, I mean. That part isn't contingent on anything. Your place here is your own. But, separate from that, I want to see where this goes. Between us, if you want that, I want that. All right." "All right." He picked up his coffee. "Then that's what we're doing." "That was remarkably simple," I said. "I find most things are simpler if you say them out loud." He looked at me over the rim of his mug. "I've been told that's a difficult skill for alphas." "Who told you that?" "Harold." "Harold." I laughed, which startled him, and then he smiled. That almost smile that wasn't quite restrained anymore, that had a warmth in it that I was going to have to get used to being on the receiving end of. The kitchen filled up, as it always did, with the morning traffic of the pack. Mara arrived with the commotion she brought everywhere she went. Dale appeared looking for his specific coffee mug. The 7-year-old pack member, a boy named Owen, ran through on his way to somewhere important. Bruce and I stood at our respective positions at the counter and island, and there was nothing overtly different about it except that occasionally our eyes met and occasionally we talked about a thing. And it was exactly like all the mornings before, except that the door that had been propped open was now officially walked through. Later, Harold found me in the workshop and looked at me once and then went back to his work without saying anything. "Told you so?" I offered. "I don't do that," he said serenely. "I merely observe." January is a particular animal. Long and gray and internal, the kind of month that turns the whole world inward. Westbrook in January was fires in the evenings and long dinners and the slow work of the dormant season, planning and repair, and the paperwork of running a small operation through the cold. Bruce and I were learning each other. It was a different learning from the one I'd been doing since October, when I'd been cataloging him from a safe distance. This was closer, more textured, more honest. I learned that he was not a morning person despite appearing as one, that the calm efficiency of his 7 a.m. self was an act of will that cost him that he was genuinely human before 9. Apt to be quieter and more easily startled than at other hours. I learned that he cared about the pack with a ferocity that he didn't often put words to, that it lived in actions. The way he'd sit up late going over accounts to find room in the budget for something a pack member needed, the way he remembered every individual person's situation. I learned that he had never really believed, when he started Westbrook at 26, that it would become what it had. He'd built it piece by piece with the focused determination of someone too busy doing to think about whether it was possible, and then one day it had become real and whole and his. And he wasn't entirely sure what to do with that. I learned that he put heavy expectations on himself and almost none on other people. He learned me too. He learned that I'd been late to everything as a child, and hadn't changed that I had a strong preference for silence in the mornings that he respected with impressive consistency. That the workshop was where I went when I was processing something difficult, and the best way to check in with me was to stop by with a genuine reason rather than a pretextual one. He learned that I'd spent the first 23 years of my life feeling like I was adjacent to places rather than in them, like I was always slightly off-center in whatever space I occupied. That the late designation had felt like confirmation of something I'd always suspected about myself. That I didn't fit the standard templates. "You fit here," he said, on a January evening when I'd told him this, sitting on the couch in the library with the lamp on and the fire low, not because of the designation, because of who you are. "You barely knew me before the designation," I pointed out. "I know. But I've known you for 3 months now, and I'm telling you, it's not the biology, it's you." He was holding my hand, thumb tracing the edge of my knuckle. "You're the kind of person who figures out where the work needs doing, and does it without needing to be asked. Who can be in a room full of people, and still be the one actually paying attention? Who reads the same paragraph 12 times, because they're actually living in the world instead of just on the page?" I looked at him. That last thing was not a compliment. It was a description, he said, of someone present enough to be distracted by things that matter. I pressed my forehead against his shoulder and felt his arm come around me, and I thought about the word present, which had been the word I'd used for him and which he'd just used for me, and how it was maybe the most important word either of us had. Outside, January did its January things. Inside, the fire settled. February brought a question I'd been deflecting since arriving. What was I? Not in the existential sense, in the logistical one. My transitional residency period had officially ended in early January. Dale had quietly, delicately mentioned paperwork options. Temporary extended status or formalization as a full pack member. I hadn't answered immediately. I'd said I'd think about it. I was thinking about it now, standing in the cold outside the workshop, watching my breath in the air. Full pack membership wasn't something to take lightly. It was a commitment to the place, to the people, to the whole living organism of a pack. It also, and this was the part I was sitting with, meant something about me and Bruce, not in a pressurizing way. But if I joined the pack, I was joining it, all the way. That wasn't something you did provisionally. Bruce had not mentioned it. He'd let it be entirely mine to bring up, which was both maddening and exactly what I'd have expected from him. I found him in the early evening in the small office off the main hall where he handled pack business. He was reviewing something on a laptop, glasses on. He looked up when I knocked. "I want to join the pack," I said, from the doorway. He took off his glasses. "I want to be clear," I continued, because clarity was something I was practicing, "that this isn't because of you and me. I mean, it is in the sense that you're part of the pack and part of why this is home. But it's not contingent on that. If things between us changed, I'd still want to be here. This place is mine now. These people are mine." I stopped. I wanted to say that part explicitly. He stood up, came to stand in front of me, and his expression was doing the thing again, the unguarded, fully present thing. I know, he said. I know it's yours. Okay. And I want that to be yours, he said, fully and unconditionally. I know that too. He was close enough that I could feel the warmth of him, and the cedar and pine scent that had long since stopped making my knees unreliable and had just become the smell of home. Also, I said, I want to tell you something. Okay. I think I'm falling in love with you, I said, conversationally, as if I'd been planning to say it at any time in the last 30 seconds rather than having it arrive unannounced from my own mouth. That felt relevant to disclose. He stared at me for a moment. You say things, he said, at extremely. He stopped. Inopportune times? I suggested. No. He shook his head, and his expression was something I'd never seen on him before, something wide open and almost helpless with it. I was going to say, honest. You say things at honest times. Was it a good time, Felix? He took my face in his hands. It is an extremely good time. He kissed me, and I reached up to hold on to his wrists. And the office with its lamp and its stacks of papers and the faint sound of the pack moving through the house was exactly the right setting for the most important sentence I'd said in years. When we stopped, he kept his forehead against mine. I have been, he said quietly, falling in love with you since approximately the third time you read that same paragraph in the library without turning the page. You notice that? I notice everything you do, said without drama, just as fact. I have been trying very hard to give you room to be here without making that weird. It was never weird, I said. It was just a lot to hold. Yes, he agreed, it was. I joined the pack formally in March. Harold made a face that was clearly an attempt at neutrality and succeeded only in being warm. Mara yelled. Dale shook my hand with the solemnity that was undercut by the enormous grin he was failing to suppress. Owen attached himself to my leg briefly and then departed on whatever child errand he'd been on. Bruce stood slightly apart from the celebration, watching, and when our eyes met across the room, he looked satisfied, complete, in a way that didn't demand anything from the moment, just held it. I'd thought joining would feel like a ceremony, like a defined before and after. What it actually felt like was turning around and realizing you've been in the river for a while, and the shore is a different country now, and that's fine, that's right, that's what you were swimming toward. Spring came the way spring comes, grudgingly, then all at once. The fields came back. Harold's workshop smelled of fresh wood and drying varnish. The pack's energy shifted from the inward focus of winter to the outward expansion of the growing season. Bruce and I were easy by then. I don't mean without complexity. I mean the way a piece of furniture that's built well is easy, solid, functional, able to take some weight. We'd done the work of knowing each other across the winter, and what we'd built was something that could hold us both. He was better, I found, at receiving things than I'd expected an alpha to be, not at accepting care in the abstract. He was terrible at that, in the way Harold had described, still inclined to manage alone and explain later. But at specific, concrete things. He was learning, slowly, to say when something was difficult. I was learning to notice the signs before he said anything and not make a thing of it. We fought once in April about something that was ostensibly about pack logistics and was actually about the fact that he'd made a significant decision without consulting me, even though he knew it affected me. And the real conversation underneath that one was about what it meant that I was here now, that here included me, that I wasn't a peripheral concern to be protected, but a person with a stake. He heard that. It cost him something to hear it. I could see that. The kind of quiet cost that comes from realizing you've been carrying an old habit that no longer fits. But he heard it, and he said so. And 2 weeks later, when the same category of decision came up, he sat down at the kitchen island and said, "Tell me what you think about this," before he'd formed a conclusion. It was the most alpha thing he'd ever done, I thought. Not the authority or the steadiness or the way the room calibrated to him when he walked in. This, the deliberate choosing of someone else into the space where he usually stood alone. "You're learning," I told him. "I've had a good teacher," he said. "Harold?" "Naturally." I threw a dish towel at him and he caught it without looking. May arrived, and with it, the pack's annual spring gathering, an event that involved, among other things, the entire membership helping to plant the kitchen garden, which was both a practical exercise and an excuse for everyone to be outside together for a full day. I was on my knees in the dirt, which had been worked soft and dark by the spring preparation, setting out seedlings in the row Harold had marked. My hands were muddy. The sun was warm on the back of my neck. Somewhere to my left, Owen was involved in a project with seeds that seemed to have more ambition than precision. I heard Bruce before I saw him, his voice carrying from the far end of the garden where he'd been helping with the heavier infrastructure work. He was coordinating something with Dale about a trellis, the conversation efficient and familiar. Then he was there, crouching down beside me, examining my work. Even spacing, he observed. Harold is very specific about spacing. Harold is specific about everything. He reached over and adjusted one seedling half an inch with his thumb. That one was listing. I know, I was going to fix it, of course. He sat back on his heels, and I was aware of him the way I was always aware of him. That particular gravity, but it was different from when I'd arrived. It was familiar now, known. Like being aware of the house or the oak tree. Hey, he said, quieter. I looked at him. He had dirt on his forearm where he'd been working and squinted slightly against the spring light. Are you happy? He asked. Not are you okay, not are you adjusting, are you happy? I sat back from my seedlings and thought about the question honestly, which is what it deserved. Yes, I said, I'm happy. He was quiet for a moment, then, good. Just that. Good. With everything it contained. I turned back to the seedlings. He stayed crouched beside me for a minute, and I could feel him looking at me, that full and present attention that had undone me the first time I'd really noticed it, and that I now moved through like warmth. Go fix your trellis, I said, in a minute. Bruce. Give me a minute, he said, unbothered. I'm enjoying the gardening. You're watching me plant things. I find it relaxing. He tilted his head. You have something on your... He reached out and brushed dirt from the side of my jaw with his thumb. And the touch was brief and domestic, and sent the same current through me that it had in December in the library. Not the physics of wanting something you can't have, just the simple electricity of having it. I turned my head and kissed the inside of his wrist, quick and deliberate, and felt his pulse jump under my lips. Go, I said, your trellis. He went. And I could hear the quality of the breath he took as he stood up, and I sat in the warm May dirt and planted my seedlings and felt with each small press of soil the specific fullness of a life that had room enough in it. The oak tree outside my window had leaves by the time I understood what Bruce had really been saying that first evening when I stood in the doorway of the Westbrook Pack's meeting hall. He hadn't said it to Dale as a statement about me, or not only about me. He'd been saying it as a practice, as the principle by which he ran things, the rule he'd written into the structure of Westbrook itself. No one here who doesn't choose to stay. No one here because they have no better option, or because the power differential made leaving feel impossible, or because the alpha said so. Choose or don't be here. That simple, that radical. I thought about the first night, the soup, the stool at the kitchen island, the way he'd sat across from me, not quite watching, not watching, the room he put me in with the oak tree and the bookshelf, the space he'd made around my arrival, like someone carefully clearing a path. I thought about the door that was always open. The thing about always open doors, I understood now, is that they aren't passive. They take work. It would have been easier for Bruce, for any alpha, to let the dynamics take their natural course, to let the biology and the hierarchy and the fact of the space do the work of keeping an omega in place, to not have to think so hard about what was choice and what was pressure. He'd thought that hard every day for months. I'd thought it was distance. It was actually the opposite. The most careful attention turned not toward pulling me closer, but toward making sure the ground I stood on was actually mine. You're free to leave whenever you want. It was a promise. Not to let me go, to make staying worth choosing. I was standing at the window looking at the oak tree when I realized I was thinking about all of this. And the evening light was doing the thing it does in late spring, going long and gold and warm, and the house below me was alive with the sounds of 40 people who had over 8 months become the shape of my world. Bruce knocked at my door. He did that still, even though I'd told him he didn't need to. "Come in," I said. He pushed the door open and stood in the frame, the way I'd stood in the doorway of the meeting hall that first night. There was something he was holding, a mug, from the smell of it, tea, the specific variety I'd claimed as mine since January. "Thought you might want this," he said. "You missed the afternoon break." I was thinking. About what? I turned from the window, looked at him in the doorframe, with the gold light and the mug and his gray eyes, which still after 8 months, had the particular quality of patience in them that had broken something open in me the first time I looked into them. "About choices," I said. He crossed the room and handed me the mug, and then stood beside me at the window looking out at the oak tree. "Any conclusions?" he asked. "Yes." I held the mug in both hands, leaned my shoulder against his arm. "I'd make the same ones." He was quiet for a moment in the evening light. Then his hand came up and rested at the back of my neck, warm, steady, present, and I felt his breath against my hair. "Me too," he said. Outside, the oak tree did what oak trees do in late spring, which is to be extremely and quietly alive. Inside, the house settled into evening around us, all 40 people in their various states of being, and the kitchen below beginning to smell of dinner, and somewhere down the hall, Owen running towards something urgent. I had a room with a tree outside the window. I had my hands and Harold's workshop and a specific mug and a crack in the ceiling I'd stopped trying to fix because it had become part of how I recognized where I was. I had a pack that was mine. I had a man standing beside me who'd built an open door and waited, with extraordinary patience, for me to walk through it of my own accord. The Omega never left. Not because he couldn't, because this was, in every way that mattered, exactly where he wanted to be. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe, comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, make sure to join our Patreon. Link is in the description. Even one member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.